Does believing in providence make any difference? After all, it is a doctrine fraught with difficult questions and implications. In a moment, Dr. Mary Knudsen will explain that the doctrine of providence is not just some abstract notion as to how God works. It is also the basis for Christian hope and joy. But there is more. Belief in God's providence limits our anxiety about our own lives and about the future. Since we know that ultimately the future is in God's loving hands, we do not have to secure our own future by hoarding and planning against every eventuality. To try to secure our own future is a denial of providence and a form of atheism. Trusting in God means that we can allow ourselves to be open channels for God's providence to others. We are called to be instruments of the provident God by providing for the needs of others. Ultimately, Christians can seek and practice justice because we believe in providence.
The doctrine of God's providence is one of the most joyful of all the historic Christian doctrines because it celebrates God's living, active presence in creation. God is constantly active in giving life and in shaping the patterns and people of history toward God's ultimate goal for creation. Providence teaches that God continually provides in view of God's plan to bring God's creatures into relationship with God. Throughout the history of Christianity, then, the doctrine of God's providence has been understood in deep relationship to the doctrine of creation. For the doctrine of God's providence is at root a celebration of God's continual work of creation. Creation is not just an event that took place once long time ago. God is always continually active in creation. For instance, when you get a quiet moment, read Psalm 104. Notice that all the verbs in this creation psalm are in the present tense. God is now, this very instant, stretching out the starry heavens, stirring the winds, setting the foundations of the earth, giving and withdrawing life and breath. God is continually providing existence and life in all its abundant variety. God is also ever active because creation is often in peril, in part from the ever-present risk of chaos, and even more from the disorder and death that human sin brings into the world. Hence, God the Creator also works in the shaping of history to mend creation and bring creation to its ultimate goal. This is the purpose of God's calling of the people of Israel. In a sense, the story of Israel's deliverance at the Red Sea is a story of God's new creation, God's new creative act of bringing a new people and a new creation out of the waters of chaos and into abundant new life in relationship to God. Then again and again, God has to work through the subtle shaping of the historical web of interacting events, people, and nations, both to preserve Israel from the sin and violence of others and to deliver her from her own repeated falls into unfaith and idolatry. Finally, the whole New Testament rings with the song that in the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Creator of heaven and earth is doing an astonishingly and unsurpassably new thing. An exodus in which God is delivering us from the power of death itself and inaugurating the ultimate new creation, which will include even the dead in joyful new life. The story of God's providence is indeed a joyous one. But the doctrine of providence also raises profound questions that have sometimes divided the Christian traditions from one another and have deeply troubled the hearts of believers. Is everything that happens the will of God? What about suffering? The leukemia cells that destroy a child's life, or the sudden car accident that kills a family of 5. Are these willed by God? And if so, why? For what purpose? And if they're not willed by God, are they just the result of meaningless chance, capricious bad luck? First, is everything that happens what God wills to happen? This question has had different answers in the history of Christianity. A lot depends on how we understand God's relationship to time and the way this understanding shapes our reading of the Bible. Now, for much of traditional classic Christian teaching, God is understood as transcending time, beyond time. God's eternity is not an endless duration in time, but a timeless now, set above time, from which God beholds the whole of time. What's going to happen in 5 minutes and 100 years and on the last day of creation is already happening right now before the eyes of God. Moreover, God not only beholds this whole span of time and so sees in a single vision all that is, was, and will be, but God also creates in a single act that whole span of time to be precisely as it is, in every second of it. To be sure, we creatures may find that many things in our lives seem to be due to the coming together of our freedom and chance events. But God has from all eternity created our freedom and those events to intersect in precisely that way. This classical view of creation holds lots of surprises for creatures, but no surprises for God. Every event in every instant is willed by God from all eternity to occur exactly as it does. The continual dynamic source of creation's life and unfolding history is timeless eternity. Now, this understanding of God and of time has great beauty and power, not only in the majestic transcendence it ascribes to God and the intricate pattern of providential events that it finds in biblical history, but also in its pastoral power to assure believers that the whole world is indeed in God's hands. In his Institutes of the Christian Religion, for instance, John Calvin writes beautifully and movingly of the comfort believers can find in trusting that existence is not ruled by meaningless chance, capricious fortune, or implacable fate, but that everything that happens is a direct result of God's loving care, however difficult it may be for us to see sometimes. By contrast, other Christian thinkers, including many contemporary theologians and biblical scholars, argue that the Bible gives more evidence of a God who is actively involved in time, responding to, even sometimes surprised or frustrated by God's creatures, sometimes even being persuaded by the pleas of God's creatures to change God's mind about what God will do. Now, in this view of God and time, God works in response and in ongoing interaction with God's creatures, as well as working without us in providentially shaping creation and history. Indeed, in a sense, God works from God's goal, God's future for us, into time, in time, responding to what we do in such a way that this future, this goal will be realized. But there's a looser weave to the web of God's providence than in the traditional view, for it also includes the unpredictable freedom and fallibility of God's creatures with all their risk. Moreover, in this view, God's life is profoundly affected by God's interaction with creatures, above all in God's own incarnation in the crucified and risen Jesus. And creation is not a closed system, complete in every moment from all eternity, but an open one, open to God's still coming future for us and for all creation in the risen Jesus and the power of his resurrection life, a future that hasn't happened in its fullness yet. God's transcendence on this view consists not in a timeless eternity untouched by time, but in the depths of God's journey with us into time, and in the power of God's coming future in the risen one to open all the graves of history and redeem the past, the dead, time itself. The continual dynamic source of creation's life and unfolding history on this view is the promise and power of God's coming future. This understanding of God and time also has great power and beauty. In the rich dynamic complexity it ascribes to God's interaction with God's various creatures, in the depths of divine compassion and suffering with creation that it attributes to God, and in the centrality it gives to the resurrection of Jesus and the power of the coming future. And there's much pastoral wisdom here too, encouraging believers and congregations to risk radical trust in God's future for them and for their communities, instead of relying only on the way it's always been. This view also provides support for understanding petitionary prayer as something that really can affect the life of God and life in the world. Each of these two ways of understanding God and time also has a different emphasis in their responses to the problem of suffering. Traditional views stress that everything happens by God's will, however hidden God's purpose may be to us, while contemporary views consider other factors, like the power of chaos and the pervasive effects of human sin in human life, even invoking a role for chance. Like the Bible itself, however, both views will seek to detect retrospectively the ways God may be bringing something redemptive out of a terrible situation. Both will encounter events in which no redemptive dimension can be detected. And both will finally cry out to God to bring that which alone will redeem such suffering. Not reasons, but healing and resurrection life. In the end, which of these two views of God's relationship to time and so of God's providence is the most fully faithful to the Bible and to the actual reality of God? Both can find support in the Bible, depending on how it's read and the passages the reader finds central. Ultimately, both views fully affirm what the Bible so richly celebrates: that God is a living God, continually active in giving life to all that is and in shaping the patterns and people of history toward the final full realization of God's ultimate goal for us and for all creation: rich, joyful, unending relationship to God. What they differ about is the question, is the continual source of creation's life and history the timeless eternity of God, or the promise and power of God's astonishing new coming future? Perhaps as you read Scripture, reflect, talk, and pray together, you can discuss this question, which faithful Christians have not agreed on, and help us all discover more fully the joyful truths of God's providential presence with us.
The doctrine of providence leaves many questions unanswered. But perhaps that is one of its values, for it reminds us that the purpose of doctrine is not to explain the unexplainable, but rather to help us be obedient to God with the knowledge and the understanding we do have.